esta charla magistral que nos va a dar Marcel Kornfeld. Marcel, más que un colega, es un amigo que me recibió en el 2009 en el marco de mi beca postdoctoral externa de CONICET por 6 meses. Así que desde ahí tenemos una excelente relación y tiene una excelente relación con muchos investigadores de Argentina vinculados con muchas temáticas de ocupaciones paleoindias en Norteamérica, ¿sí? Un poco voy a resumir algunas cosas de Marcel. Él se recibió, se doctoró en Estados Unidos, en la Universidad de Wyoming y de Massachusetts. Y gran parte de las investigaciones, como les decía, la ha enmarcado sobre todo en ocupaciones de grupos paleoindios en el centro-norte de Estados Unidos, sobre todo en lo que es el estado de Colorado y Wyoming, como los dos lugares más importantes en donde él ha hecho investigaciones arqueológicas. Uno de los yacimientos por ahí más relevantes y que ha tenido muchas publicaciones durante varias décadas y que ha sido objeto de un libro es las investigaciones en el sitio Hell Gap, ¿sí? Que es un sitio que se encuentra en el límite de las planicies y las montañas rocallosas, y uno de los sitios más importantes para lo que es la arqueología norteamericana, sobre todo porque presenta una secuencia cultural importante de ocupaciones paleoindias que seguramente va a ser objeto de esta presentación. Marcel es docente de la Universidad de Wyoming, ha sido docente durante muchísimos años en diferentes cátedras de la universidad. Ha sido director también del Instituto Friesen, que se ubica en la ciudad de Laramie, y también director de parte de lo que sería el patrimonio cultural de Hell Gap, donde el sitio que ha sido excavado por varias décadas, ¿sí? Ahora forma parte del patrimonio de Estados Unidos. Es un hito cultural importante y en base a eso, sobre todo por los trabajos que ha hecho Marcel Kornfeld y Mary Lou Larson, su mujer. Marcel es la segunda vez, si no recuerdo mal, a Argentina. No solo vino a brindarles una charla a ustedes, sino a tomarse unos buenos vinos. La otra vez fue en San Rafael, así que conoce de vinos y seguramente la charla de él va a ser rápida para poder disfrutar del ágape que tenemos después. Así que bueno, le doy la bienvenida a Marcel y los dejo con él para esta exposición.
Well, I apologize. I'm going to be speaking English. I don't speak Spanish, unfortunately, so that goes in the way of saying that I really have no idea what Pablo said about me. Other than something about Paleo-Indian, I assume he said I was a Paleo-Indian specialist, which may be a good thing, and you might understand why. My talk will be more about Paleo-Indians than almost anything else. First of all, I want to thank you for a very kind invitation to come here and I hope to learn a bunch about prehistory archaeology of the Pampas. I'm delighted to see some friends around here that I have met before. I was in Argentina only once, and I'm happy to be at this conference. And I learned just today that this is the 10th conference, but the conferences occur every 2 to 3 years, so it's been going on for roughly 25, 30 years or something like that, which is actually very similar to a conference that I'll be mentioning that was started in the area of the Rocky Mountains some time ago. Okay, so from Clovis to Cowboy, I'm basically going to talk about the prehistory of the North American plains, but as I'll explain that in a little bit, it's actually only a small portion of the plains. I was asked if I would talk about some big, okay. Actually, can you hear me if I talk? Okay, good. I know, but some of the major topics that I'm being taped. Oh. Of course. How could I? Right. Anyway, so what I was sort of suggested that what I would talk about is things like some major areas of prehistory of the plains. For example, first people of the plains, Holocene hunter-gatherers, subsistence intensification, if there is any such thing, introduction of pottery and agriculture, and then colonization. At least that was my interpretation. What I was more or less expected to do here. So that's more or less what I intend to talk about, with caveats that will be coming here shortly. Why isn't this changing on the screen over here? No, not on that screen, the little screen. I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Well, I want to start out by saying that a publication on the prehistory of the Northwestern Plains that me and my colleagues, what? No, I don't think I need it. I'm okay with the pointer. It's just that the screen here is not changing. So I can't read the little screen. Anyway, a book my colleagues and I published some years ago is the Prehistoric Hunter-Gatherers of the High Plains and Rockies, which is in some way a very awkward way of saying that we don't really work on the plains so much. We work on more in the Rocky Mountains, and that's the issue that I do want to explain and discuss a little bit over the next few slides. In any case, the description of the plains that is commonly used comes from Webb, a geographer, Prescott Webb, who described the plains as being a plain or level surface, is treeless and is subhumid. Plains is much more complicated than that, but I just want to express how this sort of thought continues throughout history, not just in archaeology, but in other fields. And Gordon Willey, in writing his North American prehistory, described the plains as being flat, prairie grasses cover the eastern part, shorter grasses on the western part, and he says that the lack of variety was compensated for by the quantity and quality of the big herd animals. And so that's 1960s, and much more recently, Doug Bamforth, in a book that he wrote on plains prehistory, he talks about a monotonous uniformity in topography, flora, and fauna throughout the region, factors that do indeed set it apart from the rest of North America. The map on the right, which I'll go into a little more detail in a little bit, actually shows a very complex environment for, or very complex geomorphology, ecology, and so on and forth of the North American plains. But before going into that part of the story, I want to look at how the North American plains came to be thought of as a cultural area and parts of those areas. So first of all, that of course goes back to well over 100 years, to the time when culture areas were being defined. And as a part of that, you had various peoples various anthropologists of the time identifying culture areas with similarities in foods and language and clothes and whatever it happens to be. Now, sure, we don't really want to go too far into this issue, but the reality is that, you know, we all work in those areas. Like, what are we doing here? We're talking to other people who work in the Pampas. And so, you know, you're either a plains archaeologist or you're archaeologist, a northeastern archaeologist or Great Basin archaeologist or something else. Well, in terms of the area where I work, when I said that the plains is kind of a misnomer for where I am, I go back to Waldo Wedel, who wrote the, you know, we should turn the lights down a little bit here on the, because I don't think that these slides are very visible with all this light, especially here. There you go, I think. Does everybody see that better now? Okay. Uh-oh, the film. Okay. Anyway, so Waldo Wedel in 1961 wrote the Prehistory of the Plains. It was basically the first prehistory of the plains. And, you know, it's clearly this area that we're talking about over here, and it was subdivided into the northern periphery, middle Missouri, central plains, southern plains, and northwestern plains. Now, Wedel looked at it another way, and he said basically that the area on the west over here was occupied by nomadic bison hunters, and the area over here by village farmers. That's, of course, late in the prehistory, once the village farmers came about. Before that, there was something else going on in this area. And Wedel also discussed the distribution of the ecological features of eastern and western plains and the role of the 20-inch isopleth in rain between the area that was farmed and the other area. And on the very left-hand side of those graphs, we see the modern cultural groups of the area, the Sarsi in the north, and various groups here, Crow, for example, down south, Comanche, and other groups, modern groups in the on the plains. So in terms of this conference, about 30 years ago, a number of archaeologists who either worked in the plains or in the Great Basin or plateau in one of those other cultural areas realized that there's something going on in between that needs to be addressed. And so based on some work that had been done maybe over the last 50 or 60 years, periodically that it would crop up in archaeological literature, would be what could be called the Rocky Mountain culture area, a culture area that basically goes down the spine of the Rocky Mountains and then includes things on both sides, so that what's happening in that area can be looked at uniquely versus always looking at it from outside. Now, having said that, let me see what my next slide is. Okay. No. I can get to the next slide. It's not showing up here, the next slide. That's why it's weird. Anyway, so about 30 years ago, we started this conference, Rocky Mountain Conference, which actually is coming up in less than a month, to really address the area that I work in. Okay, so what I want to do today in this presentation was first of all, in the first part of the presentation, talk a little bit about pampas and plains. I was told not to compare pampas and plains, and I'm not really going to compare them, but I will make some little comparisons. I want to talk about Pleistocene fauna of the southern cone versus Holocene fauna of southern cone and the plains. Then I want to talk a little bit about animal migrations, plants, and comparison of radiocarbon dates in the Pampan region and the plains. And then for the second part of the presentation, I intend to talk about, I want to talk about first people of the plains and Paleo-Indians, basically from the occupation, non-human occupation. Then the archaic, where I say we have no bison, more bison, broad spectrum foraging, house bit refugia, and farming. The no bison is sort of a misnomer. At one point it was thought that the bison left the plains when the altithermal or the hot dry mid-Holocene period quit. It wasn't quite like that, but then late prehistoric, and talk about a little bit of nearby complexity to the northwestern plains, and then look at the plains in global context, the protohistoric, the Euro-American invasion, and then cowboys and gauchos to end the story. In terms of geography, I wanted to see where the Pampas fits on the plains. Well, if you look at the Argentinian Pampas, roughly between 30 and 40 degree latitude, that puts it on the very southern end of the plains. But there's a big difference. The southern end of the plains, in fact, all of the plains, are considerably higher than the Pampas. If I understand the Pampas, we're basically talking up to about 200-meter elevation, and then we start getting into there's a few hills here and there and that kind of stuff. And when you get to the west and you get much above that, you're out of the Pampas. That's almost in some sense similar to the Texas coastal plain, except I think the Texas coastal plain probably has a different vegetation community than do the Pampas from my understanding, or at least as the Pampas did when they were the grasslands before all of these trees happened to have grown here. The area of the plains, however, covers what you see in the red circle, and you can see all of that area is higher than 200 meters, and it's all up to maybe 1,500 meters or so in elevation. And then if you look at the Rocky Mountains, again, where I work, the Rocky Mountain culture area, if you will, that's even higher than that. So that's a big difference between what's going on down here in the Pampas and the plains. And for that matter, saying that, well, let's see. Oh, yes. So for a minute, go back to look at the physiography of the plains. And what I was saying, and unfortunately I can't, oh, now I could use your, yeah, thank you. The thing to remember about the plains is, okay, so here is the plains. This is basically the Rocky Mountain front or the Continental Divide, but the plains is broken up, black hills, other kinds of uplifts, sand hills in Nebraska, sand hills in Colorado, various kinds of escarpments down here, playas in Texas, escarpments coming off the plains. You literally can't go more than 100 miles without getting some variation in the geomorphology, in the ecology, and in all of these aspects of the plains. So it is not a uniform plain. It's something that is providing a lot of variation. And it's got a wonderful environment. At least once your Americans come there and dig up the sod and the grasses and try to plant things, then we have these wonderful giant dust storms of the 1930s that can, bury a car in one dust storm. To kind of go back to this, the orange area is really the area that I work in. It's, I refer to it as Northwest Plains, and Rocky Mountains. So that's what I'll be talking about the rest of this talk, with the exception of just mentioning some aspects of what's happening on the rest of the plains, or for that matter in the rest of North America, how that might relate to those sorts of things. So this is Alaska, but fauna in this picture just happens to be a wonderful case of what the Pleistocene fauna like, late Pleistocene fauna, below the ice sheets as well. Yes, there is a few differences, but mammoths, muskox, short-faced bears, horses, camels, dire wolves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This fauna was down below the ice sheets as well as above the ice sheets. So this is a fauna that the first people pretty much encountered when they came to below the ice sheets. Down here in the Pampas, you have a little different fauna, but you also have some big critters, such as Megaterio and American horse, camels, et cetera, et cetera. The only thing that I could tell from what seemed to be, if the reconstructions are correct, that your Megatherium seems to be quite a bit larger than our Megalonyx in North America, but I'm not sure how relevant that really is. And of course, we have the Pleistocene bison antiquus that you see there. During the Holocene, the fauna has some changes, although we still have bison, but during the Holocene, the bison goes through its evolutionary stage, becomes Bison occidentalis, and then evolves into modern bison roughly around 4,000 years ago. But we also have bighorn sheep, mule deer, elk, antelope, and then a variety of small animals and birds. So naturally, there's a lot more, but we can't go into every animal that ever occupied the plains here. What's really of interest to us is animal behavior, because if people are hunting, they have to know animal behavior and what the animals are doing. So just some aspects of animal behavior that that might be on here is in terms of elephants being an analog perhaps to the mammoths, being analogs to the mammoths. They usually live in matriarchal herds with young and then female parts of the herd, with older males not being there. That has relevance of how one might go about hunting elephants, which is certainly what we see the first people in the plains doing. Couple of male deer during the rut season, when they're obviously confronting each other to see who's going to be mating. And over on the left, elk, cow elk with several young around them. And in fact, those cow elk happen to be protecting the young at this very minute that this picture was taken from the nearby wolves. And they managed to chase him pretty well, and within about seconds. The interesting thing was that these young elk were really not around the cow elk when the whole episode started and the wolves showed up, and it took about 2 seconds for them to come to their mothers and do this. So a couple of other aspects of animal behavior. Bighorn sheep prefer scraggly terrain that may not be in the mountains. These days, bighorn sheep are known to be in the mountains, but they were all over the plains, but again, in very rough terrain areas. And a herd of antelope that are actually migrating in this particular case. Now, about 40 years ago now, I assume, or something roughly like that, the archaeologist in Wyoming discovered an antelope kill site. There was antelope kill sites and bone beds known before. This was not anything new, but in this particular case, it was an early archaic antelope kill site with several hundred animals, which was one of the largest that we had known up until that time. And here is some other evidence of antelope hunting in the southeastern Wyoming, close to the Great Basin, where, of course, antelope hunting is well known. There is an antelope trap, but there's also an antelope trap known as northwest Wyoming. In fact, it's an antelope trap complex that's actually larger than what's here. We only see 2 traps. One over here, and partial trap over here. So we've known about antelope traps, nothing new. We've known antelope bone beds, but this was in a strange place, and archaeologists didn't understand why. What it really spurred is fairly quick studies on the part of zoologists and game people. They had known about migrations, but not quite as much as we do know now. So this kind of spurred the studies in animal migrations in Wyoming, and it produced a series of results like you see over here. The star is actually at the Trapper's Point site that I was just talking about. And up here is Jackson Hole area. And down here is what's known as the Red Desert. And that's the annual migration that the antelope were going through. They were going 300 miles. That's a lot for antelope. You can also see some mule deer and other roots of some of the other animals. And so it turns out that Trapper's Point was along this route, which makes a lot of sense. But that's not something that archaeologists have ever focused on in North America, that it would be, that there would be regular migrations where animals could be hunted. We know this, we know people up in Alaska do this when the caribou go back and forth and various other places, but here, it's an unknown fact, and in fact, it's still not very well researched. And so in terms of human scheduling, these migrations will obviously have an effect on human scheduling and where they're moving from point A and point B over the landscape, as will other aspects of the resources that people are depending on. This is a scheduling map, if you will, that was drawn by for the Shoshone people in the middle of the 1800s from a work done by the anthropologist named Shimkin. So here are some worldwide animal migrations. So we should be thinking about when we're studying animals, wherever we're studying animals, about these migrations, including some of the guanaco migrations that are right here, not very far from you. Okay, well, let's look at some plants, because animals are certainly a resource that prehistoric people on the plains relied on, but so they relied on many other resources. So here are things like ponderosa pine, which produces seeds, Soralia escalanta, or what's known as prairie potato, pretty rich, a variety of fruits, cattail, which has pollen and other sorts of things, wild onion, acorn, etc. So all these, and again, this is just a selection of the kinds of plants that we see being in the resource base of prehistoric people. Of course, then there is the medicinal plants of various kinds. And the thing that I think is important to remember when we talk about plants that compare to animals and animal remains that we find, plants are essentially perishable. And compared to animal remains, but also compared to other sorts of archaeological data, such as lithic artifacts and tools that things are made of. In fact, 95% or more of any hunter-gatherer inventory is made out of grasses or wood or whatever, and not stone tools, which is what we find, stone tools. So we interpret them, and we forget about the rest, and we shouldn't. Okay, so having this kind of background, what was going on in the resource base on the plains, and more specifically in the Rocky Mountain area and northwestern plains, let's look at plains, the peopling of the plains. When did people come to the plains? What do we know? What do we think we know? And what do we still want to find out? So, oh yes, so there are a number of sites listed on the left. A few of them are on the map. That's probably a very poorly situated map for most of you, but take it for granted that what it shows is Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas. In that area, there's a number of sites that have been discussed in Peopling of the Americas, and I want to talk about them now. One of these, now what did I do? One of these sites was excavated quite a while ago. It's known as the Dutton-Selby sites. There are actually two sites. The sites are located in a Peorian loess, which is a glacial outwash that ended at the end of the Pleistocene, essentially. And in that glacial outwash at this site, there were a number of extinct animals that included mammoths, horses, camels, saber-toothed tigers, and other late Pleistocene animals. Okay? Now, at this point in the history of research on the plains, it was really popular to try to find things that were, well, as it is right now, that would date previous to the Clovis period. And so on the basis of not the animals per se, but the characteristics of the bone breakage and bone modification, it was thought that it might have been modified by humans. So in this kind of case, we have what looks like a piece of mammoth bone that looks like it might be flaked. We have a piece of camel bone that appears to have an impact fracture, which is a common way of opening up bones to remove marrow. There are some little small flakes that are polished and so on and so forth, and other kinds of things. It's even more intriguing. It is, and also there are some bones that have little, what appears to be little flaking on them. These at the time were argued to be bone tools, but there was no lithic assemblage with it. It was just bone. Several years after that, or actually in many ways spurred by these discoveries, Gary Haynes started analyzing elephant places where elephants die, and elephants get then live elephants come and they trample around these bones and so on and so forth. They break the bones, bone gets polished, bone gets crushed, the bones look like they have flakes removed on them, as almost all of these do over here, and so on and so forth. All of this sort of indicated that maybe there's a problem with Dutton and Selby sites and some of the other similar sites of that nature. So, more recently, we have a site of La Sena and Lovewell and several other sites that a colleague of mine, Steve Holen, has argued show evidence of human modification of the bone. La Sena does have several projectile points, Clovis projectile points, but the bone assembly dates to 22,000 years ago. So he does not believe that this is associated because we don't know any 22,000-year-old Clovis sites. So the Clovis points apparently got there through natural geologic processes. But he does argue that the faunal assemblage, the nature of the assemblage, and that some of the modifications to the assemblage are the result of human modification. So that's where the pre-Clovis stuff is on the plains. Bluefish Cave is not on the plains, but very recently it was argued that this particular horse bone has cut marks on it, and these cut marks remain controversial. In fact, I know of a student who has recently tried to replicate those marks, and she apparently came up with a ambiguous results, let's just put it that way. It doesn't prove that these are cut marks. It doesn't prove that they're not cut marks. So that's where studies go sometimes. It's a good thing to have them. Now, you probably can't see this slide very well, which is unfortunate, but several years ago, some colleagues of mine kind of developed a model of how do you know that a site hasn't been disturbed by natural processes. And there's various kinds of natural processes, okay? And in this particular instance, they created a model called the site integrity model, where if you see these on the left-hand side are a series of levels. If you lay your artifacts on a level like this, and another level 10 centimeters up, and another 10 centimeters up, and all the way up, and then you let it sit there for 10 years, and 20 years, and 30 years, and 10,000 years, those artifacts will be moving up and down to some degree. So if you're starting off with a very clean surface like this, in 10,000 years you might get a surface like this where a lot of things have moved up and down. And with this model, they then plugged in the data where it was available, and it's fairly technical data, so it's not easily available, of a number of sites, including 3 sites that are claimed to be older than 13,000 years below the ice sheets, and and then some other sites that are also before 13,000 years old, but for example, up in Alaska. These sites have been in question. People have questioned them for the last 5-10 years or so. These sites in Alaska are not questioned. They've always known to be older than 13,000 years, and we expect sites in Alaska to be older, the oldest sites that we know in the Americas. So in this case, it shows these pre-13,000-year sites to be of very low integrity relatively. There's also some other sites that are compared that we don't need to discuss at this point, but it doesn't prove that these sites have a problem. It just simply indicates that, hey, we have sites that are not as intact as the investigators say they are, and the investigators have spent a lot of time arguing that these sites actually are very much in situ and have not been disturbed by natural processes, and therefore we're certain that they're pre-13,000 years old. Okay, well, that's for the sites that are under argument, that archaeologists argue about whether they do indicate early occupation of the plains or nearby areas. Now, for the ones that we don't argue, we have Clovis sites mainly and Folsom sites. I put Folsom in here simply. It's obviously not early, but it was a site that kicked off Paleo-Indian studies 100 years ago, essentially, from now. The other sites I want to kind of mention a little bit is Dent, Colorado, Blackwater Draw, Galt, Miami, and for the Northwest Plains, several other sites that are important in that area. Okay. So for starters, in the Rocky Mountains, all of these red dots that are from Northwest Territories down to New Mexico, they all indicate the location of Clovis localities. So the high country is full of, well, there's a lot of Clovis up there, let's just put it that way, which we all know is an early occupation. Whether there's anything below that or not, that's something that we can argue about. In the Northwest Plains, we have two sites. Basically, the Colby mammoth site with 7 mammoths and 4 projectile points. The low number of projectile points is pretty common in, in Clovis types of sites. And here's a dense site, which is actually one of the first Clovis sites identified, except that at the time that it was excavated, they didn't yet know that it was Clovis. So at that time, it was a Folsomoid site. So this is 2 of them. The most recent addition to the Clovis inventory is a site called La Prelle, and it is in Wyoming. And it is really a fantastic site. A colleague of mine is excavating this. It's got 2 other names, Fort Fetterman and Heinrich. It has somewhat of a little bit of a sordid history in that there was an issue with landowners. The original excavation found a mammoth bone bed, but really unclear whether there was anything cultural with it. And the first publication, as a matter of fact, said that this was a natural mammoth kill site. My colleague, Todd Suravel, went there about 10 years ago or so, started excavating, and started where this bone bed was and found nothing. So 2nd year, he thought, well, I'll give it another try. He found nothing. And then 3rd year, he came back, or maybe the 2nd year towards the end of the season, somebody found this chopper, quartzite chopper, not in situ, but on the talus slope. You can see the site is on a very steep slope down to the creek, and on the talus slope, right at the level of the mammoth bone, was that chopper. Well, where did that chopper come from on the surface of the site? Well, it gave him an excuse to go back for another year, let's put it that way, which is what he did, and discovered in several areas, did some backhoeing and testing and other ways of looking at the site, and found thousands and thousands and thousands of chipped stone debris and tools, and just most recently, he published on what is about the oldest bone bead from this particular site, and for North America, for that matter. Another aspect of the Clovis technology is caches. They seem to have put caches in a variety of places. So did other people, but Clovis caches tend to be somewhat unique in many ways. Simon cache in Idaho is one of the first found. and it has these large cores, preforms, and finished projectile points. Caches vary in what they have in them. They don't. They could have other kinds of technology in them. David Kilby, an archaeologist now in San Marcos in Texas, did a PhD dissertation on this, basically reviewed all the caches, and more or less found out that the caches to the north and west, to the north and west of the line, contain bifaces, and the ones to the southeast of that line contain blades. Clovis blades were known for some time, and caches had become to appear and had been published by several people. So there's this dichotomy where the blades are versus where the bifaces are. That is still a little bit unclear of why that dichotomy exists. Another one of the characteristics of Clovis is that some people, for some reason, think is controversial, is that at least in some instances at these caches, you get this overshot or outrepassé flaking on a regular intentional basis. Outrepassé flaking, flakes can come off accidentally, they can ruin a biface or whatever, but when you have this kind of a situation, this is an intentional way that Clovis people sometimes make their projectile points. Pretty interesting why they would go through that trouble, but that's what they do. Blade production of the Clovis people is typical Upper Paleolithic blade production. You get a number of rejuvenation flakes, or core tablets as they're called, as the core gets used up, and then blades are taken off of the sides. So this is, you may as well be in the Paleolithic in the old world when you see this kind of a technology. Okay, so after Clovis, I'm going to move to a site that I've been working on a little bit, and it's the Hell Gap site. It's a site in Wyoming again, and the site was important in 1960 because it essentially showed us what the sequence of Paleo-Indian cultures was at that time. And so the chronology of the site from the 60s indicated everything from what's now known as Goshen all the way up to Frederick, up in this area, basically 7 superimposed cultural complexes. The importance of this is that in all of these complexes, were before the excavation of Hell Gap site, we did not know the chronology of Paleo-Indian period. Speaking of site integrity, this particular level, if you will, at Hell Gap has not been evaluated for site integrity, but there are some characteristics that seem to indicate that it's probably a site that has not been reoccupied, rather that it is a single occupation over a period of time, a short period of time. So there is a fluting area where Folsom points were fluted. There is 3 concentrated and that distant source. We seem to have ritual with Paleo-Indian groups. Oops, sorry, I'm looking at this slide and not that slide. We seem to have ritual in Paleo-Indian groups. So, for example, at a Jones Miller bone bed, a Hell Gap age bone bed of 10,000 some years ago, there is a post that's been interpreted as a medicine post. There's also a miniature projectile point, and there's also a fragment of the flute. The investigator, Dennis Stanford here, thought that what's going on is something similar to Assiniboine shaman's activities, where there's a shaman pole that is situated in the bison kill site because it's an important activity. Okay, I need to go fast, right? I think I've talked close to an hour. Oh yeah, I need to go fast. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to go through some of this without talking about it. I want to talk about late Paleo-Indians a little bit. Late Paleo-Indians, we start seeing pit houses. So at Barton Gulch site in Montana, there's a pit house with some storage pits. When we get to the Archaic period, the pit houses proliferate. Especially in southwestern Wyoming, in that part of the northwestern plains. Anyway, they tend to be concentrated there. They vary in size, and they come in during the early Archaic. So, now I can't go back. Okay. They have storage facilities that are both inside and outside, they're really like the Elkhead Pit House Village here, tend to have a number of different houses, 4, 5, or more houses. What's going on with the pit houses? Well, for one thing, the resources that we see in pit houses are not like the resources we see during Paleo-Indian times. We see rabbits, we see a variety of plants, and those kinds of things that are in those storage facilities. Sorry, that's the slide that goes along with that. Middle Archaic period, we see the beginning of returning of bison corrals. So pit houses actually start reducing in number compared to the early Archaic, where there's lots of them. There are a number of bison corrals, and we see intensification of use of bison products. By this I mean what we see is producing bone grease and pemmican. So smashing up ends of bones, boiling it down, and then mixing it with meat to produce pemmican as a storage item. Some of the things that go along with that are boiling pits such as this, stone mauls that are used to munch up the meat and berries and the stuff that goes into making of pemmican. Then a little bit later, there are developments in eastern plains where what's known as Kansas City Hopewell. So the Hopewell type culture from Ohio spreads out there, and we see mounds, burial mounds in that area with these kinds of figurines and mica hands and so on and so forth. This kind of woodland culture, among other things, we see introduction of pottery. So this is on the eastern plains. Sorry, I'm one slide off. And this is on the eastern plains. On the northwestern plains, we see continued building of bison corrals, for example, just a little bit past this, about 1,500 years ago, there are the first developments of plains lodges and the plains village culture with the introduction of various kinds of plant foods and so on and so forth, including maize, the use of cucurbitas, and large storage pits, such as at the Mitchell site in North Dakota. Exotic objects from the Mississippian period come in, things like shell masks that are being imported from from the Gulf Coast. and other things related to Mississippian period, large villages, and bogards, incised bogards, and so on and so forth. On the Western Plains at this point, we begin seeing things like wooden structures, the conical lodges like the one on the right. They used to be called war lodges, but that was a misnomer, really. They were just conical lodges, one way to make a lodge, as well as crib log structures, such as on the left, and wickiups become part of the cultural inventory. There's also, well, there's supposed to be a bow and arrow on the left, but it is not there. There's introduction of bow and arrow comes in this time, about 1,500 years ago, and there is a reduction in size of projectile points, of course, along with that. And bow trees, which are places where one would remove bow staves. So you see over here, for example, there was a cut on the tree over here, there was one on the bottom, and then the bow stave, a piece of the tree is left there, it's left there to dry, and then it's removed so you can make your bow. Apologies, these slides are messed up somehow. I don't know what happened to them. In any case, then we get to the historic period and the Mandan earth lodges along the Missouri River, and that could be Mandan, Hidatsa, Pawnee, a whole series of groups that were living in that area in these large lodges with extended family units. And the insides of lodges are pretty much divided up into different sectors. And a lot of work has been done on these. The Mandan expansion into the Montana and into the Northwest Plains includes things like the Crow pottery, so Upsaluki, which is the Crow preferred name for themselves, were in this area by 1500, or actually somewhat earlier than that. And then we have the well-known Plains Indians, kind of, I would say, comparable to the guanaco hunters down in Patagonia. Skin working was an important part at this time because there was a lot of exchange of skins. Europeans were in need of skins, mainly to make belts for industrial equipment. So bison skins were bison were being shot by the hundreds of thousands, and the skins were sent to Europe so they could be made into belts to run industrial equipment. What this did is this really messed up women's labor. Women at this point were practically being slaves to manufacture these goods. So there was a lot of that going on at that time on the plains. Posts and battles in the plains were common. A lot of these indicate battles, and a lot of these are forts and plains. And of course, you have similar situations down here in Argentina. And Mandan village fortifications. So Mandan villages were also fortified. Not only were forts, the European forts fortified, but Mandan villages were also fortified. Current indigenous people in the area and the reservations cover a large portion of Dakotas, North, South Dakota, and Montana, and some in Wyoming. During Indian Wars, peace medals were given to people when peace treaties were written, and some of these are Spanish peace, and not peace medals, they're called something else. Grand Medal from Nebraska that were given by King Charles IV, I believe, in this particular instance. And that brings us to modern Wyoming, modern people, and, well, in Wyoming and in, I think actually, I'm not sure if that's Pampas or Patagonia on the left, and on the right, sheep herders in the northwestern plains. Now, one thing that I think is some significance to South American people is that these people that are herding sheep are actually Peruvian sheep herders that are going up to Wyoming to herd sheep. There's been a whole series of different nationalities and ethnic groups that were sheep herders that were imported in Wyoming. There were Mexican sheep herders, there were Basque sheep herders, but most recently it's been the Peruvian sheep herders that are herding sheep. Sheep herders in Wyoming make monuments. It's not exactly clear why, but it may have something to do with locating themselves in bad weather. So throughout Northwest Plains, you will find sheep herder monuments like this. And this question here is, who are the real cowboys? I'm from University of Wyoming, as I think maybe Pablo said. And so we've got the cowboys herding cows, and then we've got the football team.